Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Love, Sex, and Data conference. I am Vinita, and I work in the communications team at the YP Foundation, and it is my pleasure to introduce this panel to you today. Some housekeeping announcements before we begin. First, this session will be in English, but we do have Hindi and Marathi audio translation, as well as Indian Sign Language interpretation available for those who require it. ISL interpretation is available on this screen itself, and audio translation services can be accessed by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This panel will have a question and answer segment at the end. So if you want to drop any questions for our panelists and moderator, you can do that in the Q&A box. This conference is a safe space where we aim to expand our understanding of pleasure and therefore learn, reflect, and grow together. So we hope that everyone will engage in this discussion with compassion, kindness, and respect. We do not tolerate any instances of sexual harassment or any slurs on the basis of gender, caste, or other identity markers. In case of any concerns around safety or complaints, you can reach the YP Foundation's Safeguarding Committee or the Committee Against Sexual Harassment. Now for the good stuff. Our plenary today is called SABKI NIGAH mein SAWAAL hai. The question is data. So a few years ago, research in our masculinities program at YP revealed that young men and boys are asking this great question of how do I know whether my partner is enjoying sex? However, the curriculum to work with them only answered that consent equals no means no. So it's imperative that when we work with adolescents and youth on sexuality issues, we acknowledge that we need to listen deeply to the questions that they are asking us. In this conversation, we will hear about data from years of queries on an info line on sexual and reproductive health, experiences from one of the longest running helplines for queer people in India, and an artificial intelligence platform that analyzes Google search queries to understand what young people really want to know about sex, romance, and pleasure. Let's find out what young people's questions reveal to us about their lives and how we can connect with them effectively. I'm honored to introduce the speakers for this session. Firstly, we have Vinay Chandran, Executive Director of Swabhava Trust and peer counselor on the Sahaya telephone helpline, which has been providing support services for queer people for 22 years. Our second panelist is Rupsa Mallik, Director of Programs and Innovation at CREA. Rupsa has over 2 decades of experience in advocating for programs and innovation and advocating for sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as gender equality and justice. Biva also has prior experience working on issues of SRHR, nutrition, and mental health. Moderating this exciting conversation is Dr. Mathangi Krishnamurthy, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology at IIT Madras and author of the book 1-800-WORLDS, The Making of the Indian Call Center Economy. Mathangi also writes regularly about pop culture and media. As a queer person working to expand SRHR access for young people, and as someone who works in the digital space but is honestly quite terrified of artificial intelligence, this is one conversation that I've been eagerly waiting for. I hope you enjoy it, and don't forget to tag the YP Foundation and Agents of Ishq, as well as use the hashtag Love, Sex, and Data to talk about our conference online. Without taking up any more time, I request Dr. Krishnamurthy to kick off this discussion.
Thank you, Vinita, for those wonderful introductions, interrupted albeit every now and then, but I think we have a sense of how rich a panel this is going to be. So I'm delighted to be here moderating and facilitating all the stuff that's going to come up, no doubt, thanks to these many years of experience that our wonderful speakers have gathered. So without further ado, let me dive straight into it. I want to start perhaps with you, Biva, since we spoke a little bit about how big data figures in your work, and then I want to ask Rupsa a similar question, and likewise Vinay. So I thought in the spirit of the panel, Sabki Nigah mein Sawal hai, I will now throw questions at you, something that I'm sure all of you are used to. What I want to start is by saying, we have the elevator pitch for the work that you've been doing, and it sounds fantastic. I'd really like to hear from each of you in your own words. What is it that you do? What does your organization do? Where did it begin? Where did you find the motivation to start and continue doing this work? So origin stories, if you will. As an anthropologist, I love the story of beginnings. Can I start with you, Biva?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about what it is that Quilt does and our origin story. But essentially, Quilt believes that the internet is the largest reflection of human behaviors. So we really try to understand this data through in anthropology and technology. So we're grounded in three different areas. First is intersectionality. So understanding the cross between anthropology, technology, human behavior, and social change. So we try to inject empathy within the market research we do to understand people's behaviors in cultural contexts, but also around issues like gender, health, and climate change. And then we do this through observation and scale. So through scale, it's extracting these millions of data points, such as Google searches, to really understand what it is that people are looking for, their inner thoughts, and then to see, what are the trends that will allow us to solve some of these bigger problems. And in observation, what we're looking at is what we call stated and unstated behavior. So stated behavior is more of seeing what it is that people are publicly expressing on their social media. And unstated behavior is more of, again, what are their inner thoughts? What are their worries and concerns that they're searching about? So someone may be posting about, I went on a great night out with my girls or my friends, but really maybe they're searching for, how to cope with social anxiety. So combining these two kinds of behaviors gives us a bigger picture across these behaviors. And I think our origin story is a lot of, our leadership, our two co-founders, they believed that there is potential for technology to kind of stitch the world together, which is where the name Quilt came about. So if we can use and inject human empathy into our market research, both for commercial partners, but also for the non-profit and philanthropic partners that we work with, then in that way we can tap into the potential of the internet and the good part of the internet.
That's fascinating and wonderful. I mean, my sort of antennae immediately popped up when you said intersectionality, technology, stitching things together. And this is something that, is very dear to theorists of identity. The idea of, identity is something that we suture ourselves into, and how one can read this off queries is fantastic. And it provides a great seg for me to go to Rupsha to ask a similar question, specifically also in relation to questions of identity, change, and perplexment with relation to identity.
Thanks, Mathangi. And yeah, well, ours is, I would say, a slightly more a different origin story from what Biva shared. Kriya is a feminist human rights organization, and for over 2 decades, we've worked at the intersection of sexuality, gender, and rights. So around 2013, we were already implementing a program with young women at the community level in 3 states of northern India, Bihar, Jharkhand, and UP, called It's My Body, where we're already trying to figure out ways on how does one really reach those communities of young women to advance their sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we'd already started exploring using sports, football in particular. By 2013, it was already beginning, I think it was becoming clear that as feminist organizations that worked at these intersections, the online world, in a way, could provide a sort of a transformative, emancipatory space within which to kind of explore how our offline work could, in a way, link to this continuum of this online universe. But clearly, we were greenhorns. We didn't know enough. But what was clear, I think, in our minds was that our conventional thinking around information, education, communication, IEC, how does one layer that kind of offline sense of communication with this online world of information, communication, and technology? What is that framework that could work to really push for ways that we could reach young people to provide them this kind of information they were really seeking on sexuality and sexual and reproductive health and rights? So that's how it started. And I think we really saw the Kahi Ankahi Baatein as sort of almost like a supplementary kind of a way to reach these communities, reach larger numbers of people. And we started with a feasibility study in 2013, quite an extensive one, which looked at kind of 4 axes, I'd say. One was looking at really doing community kind of assessments, because by then one thing was becoming clear, that technology was already emerging, and particularly mobile phones which our gut told us would possibly be the pathway through which to reach these young people, was already a site of contemplation, you'll remember. I guess, communities, and particularly those who want to maintain the status quo around gender and sexuality, catch on to the emancipatory potential sooner than we do, I feel. So they know immediately where to lock down. And so you'll remember the cops coming out with all kinds of draconian things around young women using mobile phones, etc. So certainly we wanted to understand what the community perceived in terms of technology access vis-a-vis young people. The second, what was clear, you'll remember 2012, POCSO was enacted, and we already had the IT Act to layer it with that. And so the ecosystem, the legal policy ecosystem, we had to pay attention to, particularly vis-a-vis young people. The third was really kind of looking at the larger ecosystem. We recognized that there were already people out there. I mean, Vinay is here, 22 years of running a helpline. So there were models that they were out there. A peer organization like Tashi had for, well before that run the helpline. So we felt we had to learn from the ecosystem and not pretend that we were the first ones on the block. And the fourth, I'd say, was really interrogating access to tech, particularly, when you look at it through this lens of gender, sexuality, and the kind of information we wanted to impart. So post feasibility study, of course, when you overanalyze, you just tie up your hands. So, for a minute, I think at Kriya, we felt we just couldn't do it. It was too risky. It was presenting too many challenges, but I think we decided to take a leap. And I think, after all that analysis, we have the feasibility study. It's never been really published and in the public domain, but would be happy to share it with the audience here. I think we just said, okay, let's go for it. And I think two things, we were clear that it wouldn't be a big bang launch and all. Let's do it slow. So do it more subversively. And two, I think my only nod to the very restrictive legal landscape was when we were preparing the communication material, I said in the smallest possible font, please put this information is for people above 18 years. And I ensured the font was pretty small. But there was that. And then we just went for it and we launched Kahin and Kahin Baatein in November 2014, and it's still going strong. And we do have a lovely film that was in fact made by Paronita that we'll be happy to share the link with, which will give a little more texture to some of the things that I've shared.
Thank you, Rupsa. And it's quite a complex terrain that you're charting out, because if I follow it correctly, with Biva, we are talking about a direct access to starting from technology or big data as the ferment through which things can be understood. Whereas your years of experience are about moving to an understanding of community-based technology adaptation, or how to understand tech not in big data terms, but how the audience itself sees themselves as technologically adept subjects and then moving on from that. I also really love the idea of kahi unkahi, right? The unkahi being the kind of stuff that floats in the ether that one is able to access through technology, whatever shape or form it may take. So I want to come back also to your focus on gender and sexuality itself and how it has morphed over time. But good time to also turn to Vinay and speak about a helpline as a basic tech form, right? The idea of that predating this in a sense, and also to use that to speak about the work that Sahaya and you've been doing for a while now.
Thank you so much for having me here, Mathangi and YP and Agents of Ishq. Thank you so much. But I think our conversations are tying in very nicely, since Biva comes in from the technological aspects of it, and Rupsa is kind of standing on both sides, looking at both issues. And I've come in from, we started, with the desire to provide support services, or at least access to support services for LGBT people. And we used to only limit ourselves saying LGBT. It has obviously changed since then, back in 98, 99, where we were thinking, the way people reached out to support services was through either postal emails, postal letters, etc., or through the telephone. And I think at that point of time, Tarshi's helpline was the only one that was really providing gender and sexuality kind of inputs. And Radhika, who was part of NIMHANS in Bangalore, who studied here, etc., had started that in New Delhi. So we had an idea of that being a way of communicating with communities across India. And one of our examples of why this was useful, even through, for example, the media influences, was that people would look at even negative stories about LGBT in say, mainstream media, and try and reach out and contact those services. I remember an example from '98 when a local, for lack of a better word, tabloid, basically wrote a story about the hidden sex societies of Bangalore. And they were talking about groups like Sabrang and Good As You, which I was part of at that time. And the spin that they gave it about, people creating these underground sex societies was, that they were creating the demand for that sort of salaciousness. But what happened after publication is that almost, immediately we got calls from across Karnataka saying, where is this organization? We need to reach out and, meet others like ourselves. So it was quite interesting. And that's why, using a telephone helpline to provide these kind of services seemed valid at the time. When we started providing these services, that was the only objective, to do a telephone helpline. But I think in terms of experience, there wasn't much available of people who could provide counseling on gender and sexuality on the telephone, especially in Bangalore, because at that time in southern India, there weren't other kind of helplines that worked on this. And now, even after so many years, most of the helplines seem to focus more on health and HIV and STDs, and less on identity and acknowledging desire and pleasure and things like that. So we got thrown in at the deep end of the pool quite from the right, get-go. So our first day of functioning, we had decided we will open 6 to 8 p.m. on Tuesdays and Fridays. And on Tuesday, when we started, between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., we got 40 calls continuously, and the phones didn't stop ringing after that. We stopped advertising for the telephone helpline. We get free classified ads, etc. Back in 2005 or 6. We haven't advertised after that, but we still get calls even today from people, who kind of say, I was laying out a cupboard with newspapers, old newspapers, and I noticed your number in that newspaper. So people were calling in based on that and saying, I need support. Where is the LGBT community? So that's kind of the origin story. And from there, we took it on to looking at mental health and research and documentation and so on. I hope I'm not rambling too much. Sorry.
Not even close to rambling, Vinay. I would ask you to go on, in fact. And in fact, I might just keep you on the spot for a little bit more, because I do think the work that you started 2 decades and some ago encapsulates the kind of spirit of the panel. You start with questions, and it speaks to me of the kind of story of, say, a 4-year-old standing and saying, why? Then you answer a question and then say, then, but why? But then why? So you start with a series of questions and you get immediate access to an audience that is hungering for what you didn't even know you were going to provide.
Yeah.
And then you go and find out.
Yeah. But not only that, it's also about reading signs and working with the LGBTQ communities, even if the article that is in the media or anything is not directly addressed to the LGBT community. A lot of us can read the signs that of the language that is being used that tells us that this is about me. And really, you know, that's where the need to try and ask the questions that gives you those hints. I mean, today, of course, it's no longer like that. A lot of people just call up and say, I need help, I'm being thrown out of home because I'm transgender or because I'm gay. So there's no need to disguise, you know, the language now. But when we began, it was all about trying to keep it, you know, innuendo laden so that the right kind of people get the message, and that it doesn't just become hello, can you send me 2 girls to my room kind of thing, right? Which is also calls that both Tarshi and we have received over the years. So we know that there is, you know, that people are looking for signals. So I think that's also a way that questions kind of arise.
I'm going to ask you to speak more about that when I speak to all the panelists about language, definitely. I'll come to our next question, but I do think across all 3 forms of work that the 3 of you are talking about, I'm curious to know about, one, how your politics may have transformed over time along with the people that you work with, but also what you think are the politics you would like to embody as an organization. And I'd like to start with Biva, because big data sets of hackers, right? The idea that all of this data is available, you can read it, and Quilt works at the kind of intersection of both for-profit and not-profit. It is not necessarily only for community-based work. So I'm really curious to know, Biva, this data that you have access to, that you're reading, as you so beautifully explained, both in terms of what people are projecting and what is it that they may actually be feeling, since we know social media is such a hot pot for presenting self in a manner that is not quite of any relationality to ideal selves. So I'd like to know, what are the kinds of ethics, politics of Quilt and the work that you all do?
Sure. So I think there's 3 different interesting points here. So first, I'll kind of give our usual spiel that we do follow, of course, the global guidelines and the national guidelines of the countries we work in on how we're safeguarding data. So there's that. But I think what's important also is that we're really accessing data that's already public. So, you know, a lot of times people think it's data that, you know, we're mining in some way, but it's not. It's Google search trends, which anyone can access. We know there are digital agencies that do this all the time. There's Google mobility reports that we've used. So again, these are all publicly available. There's ways on Twitter where you can advance searches to really understand some of the narratives coming up in a campaign, in a movement. So again, there's nothing unique, nothing new in the data we're pulling. It's just how we analyze it is more unique. But as you've mentioned, I think what is really important to touch on is that definitely myself, coming from having worked in a philanthropy and a social work background, I was very averse to you know, big data and understood its potential harm. And coincidentally say that in a week where someone is testifying in front of the US Congress about the harms of Facebook. So we absolutely support people who are holding these tech companies accountable. I mean, that's something that has to be done. I think where Quilt really steps in here is to understand how we can intervene with people who are already on the internet to make it safer. So one of the research we did last year was looking at.
But broadly, Rupsa, slightly different form for you, because you yourself spoke about starting with feasibility studies, which I'd be really interested to read, by the way. It'd be lovely to know how is it that you both went about it as well as what happened. But broadly, how has Kriya transformed over many decades of work? How have your politics transformed? Is something that, would you speak about it for a little bit?
I want to say, Mathangi, Biva's back. Do you want to go back to her and then circle back to me so that she can just finish up, or what do you?
Oh, wonderful. Yes, let's circle back to Biva. Biva, you got
Sure.
interrupted at that point, if I remember correctly, when you said you were speaking about your own kind of reluctance moving
Mhm.
between non-profit to the for-profit arena. You could just
Yes.
continue from there.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So yes, so definitely, again, talking at a time when there is a lot of contradiction against these big tech companies, but where Quilt really steps in is how to make sure that people are navigating the internet so that it is safer and equitable. So I'll give you an example. Last year, we were doing research about how young people are talking about sexual and reproductive health on the internet. And we realized that searches for abortion pills and home abortions had increased by 48% across 7 different cities in India. So and this is especially during the lockdown. So we understand that there is some kind of a need for these services that is emerging. But when it comes to, accessing these services at such a time, the first place that people are going is Google search, which means that there's also a need to meet them where they start their journey of understanding how to access, information about abortion, sex.
But just as we were waiting, I was just thinking about precisely this as to how I don't have a memory anymore, that the moment any query strikes my head, I jump straight to a Google search. And in that sense, it's truly is such a great indicator of what current forms of thought may be. And part of it may be very skewed, of course, by both internet and language access, which I'll speak about in a little bit. Biva, you're back.
Yes, just on that, Mathangi, I think it's also important that when people are searching for this on YouTube or Google, I mean, the top 5-10 searches that they look for that appear are the most important. And we've actually found on these topics, those searches are either websites from the US, so like WebMD or Planned Parenthood. But we have to make sure that people aren't navigating through a whole host of incorrect information just to get to what, something that's safe and correct. So it's making sure that even organizations and philanthropies understand that, is it the marketing they have to do better? Is it the top 5 searches where certain numbers or services are accessible? So that's kind of where Quilt falls into, and I think what we want to continue to embody in terms of making the internet that safer place for people.
That is fantastic. And I'm thinking about how WebMD is my current nemesis as a practicing hypochondriac. That in a sense, the idea of information being freely available also makes it sort of pertinent to see what kinds of information, because it's all over the spectrum. And we are talking about young people in the throes of crisis often that are turning to these resources. Greatly interesting. Thank you, Biva. Good time, Rupsa, to come to you. I won't repeat my question, but sort of just to ask about how politics interventions, vantage points may have changed over time.
Couple of things that I should have really started with. I do want to kind of foreground the fact that Kahi and Kahi Baatein has been an amazing partnership with a tech company called Grambani, with Tashi, with community radio stations, a host. So, I speak here as somebody from Kriya, but this journey has been really a co-created space of learning, mutual learning. So that's one. Two, I think I just want to add one comment, just linking back to what Vinay was saying, is that I think, really we need to interrogate all of us who've been doing the work on sexual rights and sexuality education is, the model I think is still not shifted. It's still about this imparting. It's about curriculum. It's about we know, we tell you. Whereas, what has been fascinating, I think, for us at Kahi and Kahi Baatein has been that the question, and when you start listening to the questions deeply, that's what we need to move towards. And I really don't know how our current kind of models of work can shift in that direction, and how some of the things that in fact we are learning very richly in the online space, now is the time to reverse it back. So, we spent years understanding the offline work and learning about how to then navigate the online. But I think the time to reverse and link it back, and so that's the point I wanted to make. In terms of our kind of politics, ethics, I think pretty early on, and it was infused with our own work offline, which was deep thinking around consent, around issues of confidentiality. So for sure, for any of us, even the tech was unknown, those principles were foremost in our minds. So I think when we started thinking about a tech-based intervention, for sure, issues of privacy, confidentiality, and privacy were foremost, right? And I think what very quickly one began to see is while there was a very active discussion around privacy, even confidentiality, I still think the issue of how, this issue of consent and data, I think it's still something we're not looking at deeply enough. To me, sometimes it feels, particularly in this world of data mining and extraction, there is a kind of a nod to consent, almost like, I keep, the parallel I can draw, it's like marriage, no? And one-time consent and then anything post that. So it's a bit like that. You've taken that consent, done a nod to it, and then where the data is streaming down and how and who's extracting, who's using. Like, for example, today, I did consider using some of the audio clips that we have, and we have all of it. But I've never used it ever in a public forum, and I was like, why should I do it today? Because, the caller has not given me the consent to play that audio. So I think that is something. So I think that ethos has always driven our thinking at Kriya when we started shaping Kahin Unkahin Baatein. And I think we work very closely with Grambani, who are just amazing. For example, looking at the back end, the data security. Even I didn't know enough. I knew enough to know that there's going to be rich data sitting. I was concerned who's going to have access to it. Till date, a very small group of us have access to the back end, right? And so that was one. I think when we started exploring the tech platform itself, like what would be the most amenable to doing this that we were setting out to do, again, I was, I think the feasibility, I think we were very clear that how could we make it caller or user initiated versus this pushing out of information, of data, So even when they're supposedly creating a platform which is about them asking the question, the model, the tech model that we use is often the other way around. And that's where I think Ramani's, the mobile phone based platform, it's an IVRS platform, which is actually a caller initiated platform. So the caller decides when, how they will call, and then once they call, then the callback goes. So it is at their initiation. So that seemed to me like the closest approximation of how this anonymous caller sitting who knows where, negotiating this access to tech and their environment, is having some control over how they are accessing information through this sort of I don't want to use the word low tech, but like a different tech. It wasn't an inter-based platform. Kahin Unkahin Baatein is you can call through a basic phone as well, which was the other thing because it was about access. So I think we thought a lot, Mathangi, about all these things. And I was very, very always, for example, resistant to mining the data straight away. We were very interested to hear the conversation, hear the questions, and actually, really foreground how we could just respond to those individual callers' questions. And I think that's something I think in the tech world, it's still a contestation, I think, between the kind of interventions, let's say, that a Kahin Unkahin Baatein is, and what is the most amenable way in the tech universe to do that. And then there's just the final thing I want to say is that this tendency in the online or the tech world to kind of immediately assume that you're kind of doing a tech-based intervention and that equals to behavior change equals to impact. So that was the other thing. I said, let's be really humble about this. We are giving information that seems relevant. We're getting whatever questions, we seem to be responding to that. That's about it. I really don't know who this caller is and how they're negotiating their offline universe. So let's not make claims. So I think the other thing we really must think about in the larger ethics of what we do today is this claim of impact, this claim of scale, which, sometimes organizations like ours, when we enter that world, it's very tempting to go down that road. So you have to really fight at times the lonesome battle to be claiming the millions, to be claiming the behavior change. But yeah, I mean, I'd say Kriya's core principles of what we do and what we believe in very much infused our work, when we kind of brought in this tech-based kind of an intervention into our portfolio of work. And I'm sorry if I took longer than I should have, Mathangi. You need to just raise your hand if you think we're kind of going on and on.
Not at all. I'm transfixed and I'm not even making that up. Rupsa, you're indexing something which I think is so important, which is I tend to think of it as a relationship between capacity building, for example, and say health policy, which always wants you to make large claims about what a population is undergoing. So the question of what does someone need, as opposed to who do we think they are based on what they're asking. And the gap between that is not so easily surmountable. And I'm also thinking between the data that Biva is accessing, Quilt is accessing, and the data that you and Grambani is accessing. I tend to think of it also on registers of intimacy. And you brought up the question of consent. And I know AOI has a fantastic video, a lovely video about consent that I use all the time to teach about the gray territory. So it's all right, for example, to share a Google search that somebody sent out into the ether as public information. But the moment you have somebody's voice that you're sharing, there's a different register of intimacy. There is access to somebody's subjectivity almost that they haven't given consent to. But the lines are so slippery. I feel like all of my online personas are available in public view, not all of which I have consented to. And yet that's the condition of me getting access to information, that first I make myself available to the world. So the question also has become such a slippery slope in the form that it's being sent out as. And this might be a good time to turn to Vinay then and ask, Vinay, you've been working with these, terribly precarious positionalities when they were much more precarious than they are now, both in terms of the language they had to use to be able to speak, to be able to find some kind of simpatico voice, if you will, at the end of the line, to the point where they can say, we are being thrown out of our homes, can you send help? Or even the in-between, send 2 girls to our house kind of expression of desire, as strange and naughty and mischievous as it may be. So could you speak a little bit about how you've been thinking about these questions in terms of politics and ethics as well? Big, sure. Small p politics, small e ethics.
Yeah, no, to begin with, the response to the question about send 2 girls, that wasn't an LGBT question at all. It was men who look at an article that says there is a telephone helpline providing support for issues on sex and sexuality. They focus on sex and they think this is a helpline to pick up or partners on, and therefore, they think this is a brothel or something like that. So I'm tempted at those points to say, yes, please give us your credit card number and we'll let you know, kind of thing. But of course, ethically, that's not what we do.
I think that would be all right at that point.
I know. But we don't look at sex work necessarily as a bad thing. We'd like to speak to about those issues as well. But looking at how we've changed, and I think I indicated some of it in the example I gave earlier about how we got so many calls post one particular media article. And I think that's kind of the way we look at our politics, if you will, that people are so desperate for information, especially if you look at areas where they don't have access to support groups or NGOs working in the area. They're so desperate for information. It doesn't come as a surprise to me, for example, that we get calls from Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Kashmir, right down to Kanyakumari and else. And because I manage speaking 5 languages, it's easier to handle as many of these questions as possible. But why should a telephone helpline in Bangalore be the one responding to local issues of people in Assam or Arunachal, but LGBT issues? And so there is a desperation for accessing that knowledge. And in that context, Google today, Google searches help a lot more, even though I don't want to name them every 5 minutes and give them some publicity. But that it really is, Google searches become the free classifieds of today, where you're looking at ways of accessing. And even today, when I ask a caller, how did you find out about us? It's almost always, I found you on the internet. And what is the response to that? Google search, right? So how did we transform? We really think that we are providing a certain kind of service, regardless of how we phrase it, right? And I think the question that Rupsa also said about looking at the difference between, you know, I'm providing information or I'm providing guidance or advice to someone who's called, as opposed to there's somebody who's desperately requiring assistance and requires a certain kind of support from me. I think the problem with that is only that what we have seen over the last 2 decades that we've done this work is that people will still interpret it in the way they want. Whatever advice, suggestions, information you give, you know, Google search and WebMD and all of those are problematic simply because you can't control the way that information is read. Not necessarily that the information is right or wrong, right? Because we know people who, right in the beginning, for example, in terms of how the transformation, when we started the helpline, and people said, I want to come and interact with the community. And we weren't sure who these people were. There could be journalists, tabloid journalists who are looking for a sensational article. They could be the cops at the time. You know, those were worries. Organizations like Sangama and the others in Bangalore were harassed by, you know, cops and others. So we knew that there were problems over there. So one of the ways we'd negotiate that kind of discomfort is try and meet the person who's called us in order to refer them to whatever services they needed. We would meet them in a public hotel that was not next to the office, but a little bit nearby. And we would have these elaborate kind of, you know, look for us. We're sitting at a table. It won't just be one person sitting at the table. We'd have to go 3 or 4 community members going together. There'd be a black cap on the table, like a baseball cap on the table. Look at us, you know, and then you know that it's us. And then we do an kind of interactive, maybe an interview, so to speak, to figure out if the person is really genuinely LGBT or just, you know. So over there, you're talking about confidentiality, privacy, anonymity of an organization that's offering the support. You know, and at that time, the counselor, the person or the client becomes potential kind of danger, right? We've moved from there to a point where people can walk into our office and, you know, even the tabloid journalists and police can walk into our office and we don't give a damn, right? We're not afraid of those situations. We're not doing cloak and dagger stuff anymore. So things have changed because perceptions have changed, but also because we've got the experience to know that when somebody walks into our office, is that a person who's a journalist who's looking for information, or it's a genuine LGBT person looking for support. We've got that experience that we have learned. And that experience is not something you can get if you're typing on Google or interacting with a certain kind of technology. And that's why, you know, that's the learning that we have, that at some point there is human intervention necessary. Right? To be able to say, yes, you need an antidepressant when you are depressed. But what kind of depression is it? You know, you don't just randomly go and ask for an antidepressant simply because you've been diagnosed with depression, right? There are ways to handle it. There is this obsession with thinking that, as Rupsa has said, information is enough. No, it's not. How do you interpret that information is also a bit of an issue. So even today, 21 years later, the confidentiality and privacy and all of those things that we were talking about, particularly when we are subjecting ourselves to that danger. Now it's the client who are still worried, but the worry they have is still, will my family find out? Will the police find out? Will my employers find out? And I don't want that to happen. And our promise to keep confidentiality, etc., by not maintaining any obvious records of any sort, not recording calls. If literally, if I die, the counseling records die with me. It's like that. So it becomes human memory, and unfortunately, that's not necessarily long-term efficient. So therefore, how do you transfer that knowledge? That becomes important. So the human component really is something that matters over here. So I don't know if I've made sense, but does that answer some of those questions?
Very much so. It is sense making throughout. And I'm going to say that we'll interrupt Google search hegemony by saying duck, duck, go search henceforth. Rupsa wanted to come in to make an additional point. Rupsa, please.
Thanks so much. No, I meant to make this earlier. I think the other thing, conceptually, or let's say in our kind of parlance, this thing of, the way we talk about privacy, consent, confidentiality. I think one of the other things that's been a great learning, or let's say forced us to rethink how we thought about these things, is when you take, when you try to do a community-based intervention using tech. And for sure, I think, here I was sitting saying, privacy, this, the data. And then moment we launched Sawal Jawab, people were calling, asking, like you were saying, registers of intimacy, the most intimate questions, giving their name, gaon, everything, and that to me told me something very different. It didn't tell me that those people didn't care about privacy. It told me that I had a greater responsibility, because the consequences of how we understand and the standard setting and guidance, there's a huge disjuncture between how that is understood and practiced in the tech world and how in a community intervention space you practice it, where the community itself is not thinking about it in exactly the same way, privacy, consent, confidentiality. And therefore, it is doubly incumbent, I think, on all of us who are doing this work to really stick to those ethical principles and really think about it deeply. Because, just by giving, a person calling and giving by their name and village is for me not the cue to therefore say that, yes, this is therefore now available for public consumption. So I think there's work to be done there as well, Mathangi. And I just wanted to make that point because, listening to Vinay kind of struck me, in a way similar to their journey.
Can I, sorry.
Please, Vinay.
No, I was also thinking that, for example, when we started, because our number was in newspapers or wherever, it kind of disappears and confidentiality gets guaranteed. It's in the newspaper, nobody can blame you, right? But today, if you're looking at your child's internet history and there's Google search looking for queer helplines, or if you look at your child's telephone and there's our number on it, you have automatically, see, how do you take responsibility for that, right? You jeopardize that particular child's life by getting the child to call you. You didn't do anything. Right. So there are these lines that that become very important. So if adults are calling me and saying that, did my child call this number? We have to say this is a telephone helpline. We provide counseling, right? And make it as neutral as possible so that you don't jeopardize the child and say, yeah, your child is turning to becoming gay or whatever, motivates the family to go completely apeshit. If you don't mind use of French.
I think both of you have put it beautifully, Rupsa. And I do think what we are speaking about in terms of responsibility becomes even more entangled in that sense, in ways where we no longer are able to make sense of the blurring between the real and the tech world, if any such difference even exists. And we have about 12 minutes left again. So I'm going to collapse my last set of questions and have you speak more because this has been wonderful. And what I want to know is to come back to this idea of the question and say you have this data. There must be some ways in which it upends what we seem to know in this sanitized fashion about young people's relationship to self, gender, sexuality. So if you could share, keeping anonymity, consent, etc. in mind, and I'll start with you, Biva. language. What are the languages of the question? What are the forms of desire that you're able to garner from it? And if at the end of it, you could just indulge me and each of you could tell me a pleasurable Sawal Jawab story.
Sure. So I'll answer both of those questions at once. I think if they could project the word cloud, please. But this is just one of the languages. It's not what I think. It's literally what people are looking for. If anyone from the tech team can project the word cloud, but it's I think it's the one before this. But essentially we, right before this one too. Thank you. So before when we were looking at searches in particular around condoms, these are some of the top searches that came up, and the bigger the word, the higher the volume. So again, this is, the language of pleasure in one way, not all of them, but in one of the ways that we've seen that, coming again from that nonprofit philanthropy side, that we've academized it quite a bit. We keep calling it contraception. But then having been at Quilt and seeing actually, what is it that people are actually, searching for in like very plain terms, it is this. It is sometimes in Hindi, but many times we see that it's English. That's not to say that, people who speak primarily Hindi or other languages are not on the internet. We've just found that a lot of times these searches are in different variations of like English spellings and etc. We've also seen in one of our previous studies, we've talked about searches around things like relationship and respect, which I think is another form of pleasure as well, within those intimate moments. And we've seen that searches for respect, girlfriend, searches such as boyfriend, respect, girlfriend, that these are actually have been increasing over time in India. So I think that's quite promising, similar to the work that Agents of Ishq or YP Foundation has done. There is a lot more out there that we hope will counter some of the negative information or videos that are out there as well. And I think in terms of most pleasurable story, again, in the next page for the pie chart, this is a study that we did actually when we are talking to, brands that sell sexual health products. What they want to understand is what pleasure looks like for people. So we looked at some of the conversations online, again, all publicly available, to really understand what is it, what are the highest volume of searches around intimate moments for people. And in the next slide with the bar chart, you'll see that we've analyzed kind of searches, and here you see kinky sex makes up pretty much a quarter of those conversations. And here we looked at 200 million, search words, and this is across 5 European countries. But you'll see here, some of the searches and questions people are asking are mainly around BDSM and using sex toys. So, this is also, a language of pleasure, one of the languages of pleasure. This is so very contrary to the asks that we get from philanthropies and nonprofits, where it's more around, like you said, a bit more sanitary, sex education, what does that mean? And going back to Vinita's original point that, the curriculum may just be about consent, but just in terms of behavior change, and that digital interventions is absolutely not the only way, that we need community interventions in order for both to work. And we've seen brands, and I bring this example up, like Coke, which exist, their products exist both on people's ecosystem and on bus stands. So if you want to incite behavior change, one way is to exist just everywhere where people are where it's visible for people. So I think in that way, digital is important, but definitely with the help of community interventions. But yes, answering a lot of questions at once.
Thank you, Biva. I must say that I find data most fascinating, much as, data sounds like weird and vague and people can't interpret it. The way you're reading it right now, it truly paints a much more interesting landscape than any of us have ever been told about. So I do think it's a hopeful landscape. Thank you for that. Rupsa?
Yeah, I was actually smiling at the masturbation data because I do think in the constrained environments we live in, self pleasure is. I mean, I would have expected to top the charts, but anyway, be that as it may. But I think a couple of things I wanted to say about the Sawal, and I loved what you said about the Sawal being this register of intimacy, Matangi. It's going to be totally be my phrase moving forward. And certainly when I look at the sawals we've got a huge repository. I was contemplating whether I should read out some of the sawals, but maybe I'll skip because I want to make a couple of points. It is quite at the end of the day, uh, desire, pleasure, it's part of the human condition, and I don't think our balance of understanding of pleasure, I think we sometimes forget that even in the most miserable circumstances, I think one of the things that I've learned from looking at the savals is whatever your context, whatever your marginalization, your structural exclusion, your poverty, it is part of our condition to think about something that's about pleasure, And I think one of the things that the Saval always, it's a bit of my what gives me pleasure in that data. It's really wonderful for me sometimes when I look at that to think, there is maybe that 10 minutes when they're calling into that info line is that moment when they're able to reveal those intimate whatever and maybe get some answers to some question. And I wonder sometimes because, one of the things I want to say is when we first started, the questions were very generic. And even when they were about intimate things, it was often the third person question. I think one of the things that I feel, I see, and it is rewarding for me. That's for me the biggest impact of Kahi and Kahi Bate, not the data mining of what we have reached and who we have reached for how many minutes. Is today most of the questions are first person. Many questions are from partners asking about the other partners, things around consent, around pleasure, around what will give this person pleasure, what can I do differently? They're much more complex. I see many, many more questions, and Vinay, this is for you, much more on issues of gender and sexual diversity. So, as you rightly said, 20 years from the time you all started to now, there's just that shift. And I think
Rupsha, could I'm sort of curious, really, although you don't want to read out the questions, I'm really curious about the language. So if you could share some words, maybe half a question or so.
I'll read.
Okay,
Okay, I'll read a
great.
few. Huh? I've opened the shared drive, but I'll read. So, and it's in Hindi, and of course, I'm not a Hindi speaker, but I'll read it. I can read. संभोग के समय लड़की चीखती क्यों है? मोटे लिंग को पतला और लंबा कैसे करे? लड़की के साथ सेक्स करने में किसी लड़के को परेशानी तो नहीं होगी, एंड आई एम थिंकिंग बॉक्सो। लड़की सेक्स कब कराना चाहती है? सेक्स करते लिंग आगे या पीछे डालना चाहिए? पति हमेशा क्यों नाराज रहते हैं? लिंग बढ़ नहीं रहा है, and this is only a very small slice of all kinds of questions. So what I'm trying to say is that and I think the savals also tell me it helps us rediscover that there is a language out there for pleasure intimacy. It might not mirror our language, our English language way of expressing, but there's just such a rich repository of language of expression out there, and that's something. And how do we take that language and infuse it into our, let's say, our sexuality education program? Is our technical, that sort of language really the way we're going to reach young people? So I think that, and I just want to end with this pleasurable data story. So two, one I've already shared is just reading the Saval. I think gives me great joy and pleasure because it tells me so much. The other thing I want to say is that we are able to access when calls are coming. So to our Sawal Jawab channel, the info line has 4 channels, of which the Sawal Jawab is one. Most of our calls come, late night, going into early hours of the morning. So I think for me, that data point always gave me great joy and thinking, yes, this person probably, living a very difficult life. I was thinking of COVID, whatever, shared device, and, there in the middle of the night, able to find that moment of connection with this somewhat anonymous helpline. But, the voice of the helpline is Gunjan Sharma, whose name I do want to call out. She's just an incredible person who's anchored this question answer space. And here's this moment this person is connecting, and for those 5 minutes they're on that call, there's that moment of pleasure, of joy, of, maybe getting rid of their fears, and who knows what that translates into in their own intimate lives. And I think that gives me great joy. So it's a very kind of a, you can look at that call time and think of it whichever way, but for me, I've always liked to think of it that way, and that certainly gives me a lot of joy and pleasure.
Beautiful, Rupsha. And that language, just to hear it, I think about when is it that we'll have sex education programs that have an entire chapter on cheek now? When is it that we'll speak about the cheek or the moan or soundscapes as part of the sexual landscape? And I'm thinking about how the questions seem to encapsulate the landscape of desire. It's not just body, it's feeling. Pati naraz kyun rehte hain? What does it have to do with moods and attitudes, and how there's a true possibility of a coming together with sexuality. So it's beautiful, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. Vinay?
I want to start off by the real reason that I'm part of this panel is also because a lot of helplines like ours, where recording data becomes difficult because of confidentiality and all of that right at the beginning of our journey, and because it becomes organizational and counselor data as opposed to research data in that sense, it becomes necessary to recognize the value of that kind of anecdotal data, right? Because it's not considered scientific by medical professionals, right? But if you take the examples of the counseling that, say, for example, our organization has offered through the helpline for the last 20 years, and the kind of learning that we have to provide both medical professionals as well as people who've gone through treatments for being LGBT, is that we know that there is a lacuna in the medical field because of that, right? We know that even though our data is not recorded and analyzed through a formal research system, the fact that over 20 years, we might have collected thousands and thousands of information, questions, and responded to those in a sensitive and respectful manner, which a counselor from a medical institution does not necessarily have the backing to, then it means that there is a institutional responsibility also to recognize the importance of anecdotal data like ours. And I think that's really where I'm coming from. And for me, the data that we have, collected anecdotally over 20-something years is important because it also transforms the way we responded to issues of crisis, issues of relationships. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, if a child had called saying that, I've come out and my family is throwing me out, I would not have known where to and how to respond to that child. Today, I know almost immediately what needs to be done, and can give, say, bullet points of what the protocol should look like, right? This protocol is informed by anecdotal data, not by scientific research. And that's a kind of important point I wanted to make. It kind of, therefore, it seems to be for a lot of us that that a lot of the help that is sought through these helplines for crisis is in order for them to decide what their pleasure can look like, or what their sexuality can look like, or what their gender identity can look like. So we're only facilitating a small aspect of their life in order for them to proceed and make the choices that they need to. But we also know that, what we are facilitating is not just opening a door or making a path towards becoming a fully functional gay man or lesbian or transgender person, but it's also to enable coping skills, because without coping skills on how to lead a life, there's no point having just pleasure and so on. And I use an example which by itself is tragic, but it's also kind of symbolic, that we recently provided access to a shelter for a young gay man, and from his family, shelter from his family, because his family is trying to get him forcibly married. And he was safe. His telephone had been taken away so that his family doesn't trace him, etc. And he was given a small phone in order for him to communicate to the counselors and the lawyers and so on. And he used that telephone to call up a Grindr date and meet with a partner. It's interesting because this is where the crisis is being resolved in order to facilitate his pleasure journey. And for a lot of us, we understand that. You've gotten to a place where you're finally safe from your family and you can do exactly what you want. But of course, the tragedy after that is the family traced that call to the police and reached the shelter. And basically the shelter had to be rescinded. And he has moved on to a legal case, etc. But just that thing that you're providing a facilitation in order for them to feel safe enough to be, to feel pleasure, I think is what stands out to a lot of the work that we do.
What a great place to pause, Vinay. And I'm thinking across all the work, and seems to me that Rupsa, Biva, Vinay, all your work is in an intersectional landscape where we are dealing with a variety of complex subjects that cannot be pinned down to a particular either subject position or state of feeling. I'm reminded of people like Wendy Brown, who says that, we want victims to behave in a certain way. And that's what sex education assumes, that everybody is sort of, miserable and you're out to help them. You must hand out information. Instead, I love the story that somebody who's being rescued and sent to a shelter is also looking for pleasure, and why ever not? Why should that be denied to them in a state of abjection, if you will? Why is an abject only an abject and not something else? And why must our sex education programs, capacity for support, not acknowledge that questions can have multiple cues in that sense? So I have a pleasurable data story that I will save for later. I'm going to pause now to take one or two questions, and I will, of course, thank you all later for your wonderful, wonderful moments of sharing in a little bit. But just a few questions that I'm going to pull out from the chat windows. Karishma Gupta wanted to know, and I'm just going to summarize it, that given POCSO's mandatory reporting, how do you support girls when they reveal they are underage and have had consensual but unsafe sex? And a related question to Vinay and Rupsa, how do you support when you don't know the real identity of girls online or when community engagement is difficult during the pandemic?
Who wants to go first?
Vinay, you start. I'll come in.
Okay, no, yeah, I was responding to, I looked at that question and I thought it's not too confusing to think about what do you do when, how do you support when you don't know the real identity of the person who's asking for help? And really, especially if the person is not a major and therefore cannot, just go and access support services anywhere. For a lot of that work we do, since again, it's about intersectionality, we networked with organizations and NGOs that work with young people and children we would initiate conversation almost instantly if we know that the person is a child. Start saying, okay, is there anybody in the family you can talk to, who you trust, right? Even if you're not being open about what the situation is that you're trying to deal with, who can you reach out to and get that person to call us so that we can provide, again, we're not providing the person the details of the problem. We are providing them the networking partners, the referrals that are necessary so that they can take the child to access that support, right? So you create these kind of linkages. Now, again, I would not have known the answer to this 20 years ago, but with the kind of human intervention counseling that we have done, we feel that that is a way that you create safety. You have to consider the person's trust and respect, because you can't really say, oh, just walk into a police station to a 14-year-old. It's not going to be that easy. Even adults who are 40-year-olds are afraid of walking into police stations. So you're not going to get a young child to necessarily do that. So we try and network through that. Does that, I hope, answers one of the questions?
Can quickly come in, Mathangi, if you want.
No, Rupsa, all yours.
No, I think one of the things I think pretty early on we were clear on is that, the Kahi Unkahi Bate was not going to be a helpline, that we wanted to position it as an info line. So actually in the early years, it was very challenging. This idea of a mobile phone based info line, there was a lot of conflation with this idea that it was a helpline. So I remember early on, because callers could always, leave their comments and questions. We got questions, or let's say, which were like, in their heads it was like they were speaking to a helpline. So I certainly have to say that those early years it was quite a bit of a challenge, because on the other hand we were not set up to do what Vinay and all are set up to do. So I think that was certainly something we struggled with. We were getting distress calls of women facing violence, etc., etc. What we tried to do as mitigation was just provide referral information, etc. But I think over the years, because it's been now 7 years, that dedicated caller base that we have, I think they have made that journey to understand that it's an info line and not a helpline where help can be sought. So that's, I think, one thing. The second is, I think even though that when I started the origin story, I said how we saw it as a supplementary strategy to our in-person work. But pretty early on, I think almost as early as the feasibility study, it became very clear that the two had to be delinked. So really to set up Kahi and Kahi Bate as this really independent, separate, autonomous space that in no way tries to link back to individuals and community, that you really make it anonymous and confidential. We could only do that because as an organization that was not interested in data mining and showing impact, and luckily we had, I must say, people who resourced us, the funders gave us that space. So I must give a nod to that, because if they were asking us for those numbers, we would have struggled. We yielded the space, the data space. We were not collecting any data. We had a very voluntary, like a survey, which just asked for some demographic information, which is how we knew who was calling, maybe something around gender, something around marital status, literally. But, we had a clear policy. If the caller called, if twice, because, the tech can do all this. If after the third time the caller hadn't taken the survey, it wouldn't be given to them. It wouldn't be offered to them again. And so I think in yielding, even though it was tech, by giving up this thing about I need the data, we ended up actually creating this space and hopefully, and also making it scholar initiated, where we pushed out not a single information. My hope is that hopefully whoever's calling could do it in whatever safe way they could, when they, and like I said, the calls come late night, midnight, etc. They found their own strategies to stay safe, to find that, private moment when they could make the call or listen to some of the content. So yes, I mean, yeah, certainly we are dealing with a very difficult kind of a landscape within which to do the kind of work, whether it's online or offline, on sexuality, and it's only getting worse. So I think certainly risk mitigation, backlash, these are serious things. I think they've always been part of the Kriya DNA because it's the very nature of our work that is in a way about risk, right? So I think our work online therefore automatically kind of embraced some of that thinking and understanding. We never went in saying, oh, now tech, therefore neutral, we can do whatever, immediately reach 1 million people. Absolutely not. So I think our offline ethos very much got infused into our tech-based work.
Thank you, Rupsha. I have another question, I think, for Vinay later on, but I want to jump to Biva. Nayantara, as well as an anonymous attendee, wanted to know, Biva, how big data can help community-based organizations, and also to speak about any examples of concrete interventions, if you may have any that you could share.
Sure. So we've worked with community-based organizations in multiple ways. One of the ways is we did a big study across 8 countries in Southeast Asia on what violence against women looked like during the pandemic. So, there's a lot of hotlines reporting that there's increase in domestic violence. So we wanted to really understand, are people also searching for help online? And we did find that in countries like India, Nepal, the Philippines, there's been a spike in searches for help-seeking searches is what we call them, but essentially hotlines and shelters during the pandemic. So we worked with on-ground service providers to really understand what it is that their digital footprint is. So what is their social media say? What is their SEO marketing like? Sharing, what are the top keywords that people are searching for, so that these organizations can also work on making sure that they appear at the top of these searches, or making sure that even on their Facebook page, the first thing that pops up is their hotline number. So we do work with service providers in terms of making sure that our community-based organizations, to make sure that their digital capacity to reach the audience is there. We also have done interventions in terms of engaging boys. So one of the ways, so similar to kind of how digital marketing tactics such as Facebook ads, we've definitely tried to understand how we can also exist on people's Facebook timelines, but in a way where we are sharing more information about what a healthy relationship looks like, about safe sex, about using condoms. So these are also some of the interventions that we've kind of explored. So again, kind of bridging that gap between making sure that the internet is the space where people are navigating and getting access to the right information in one click. Yeah.
Thank you, Biva. And one last question for Vinay, I think, and since we've all been speaking about iterative learning as to how protocols being dictated by anecdotal data, if you could speak a little bit more about that.
I think I gave that example in terms of the question from Karishma, where you're talking about someone who's called you and you don't know how to help them out because of issues related to the pandemic or whatever the context might be. So, if there is no recorded, data analysis or research that's come out that tells you, okay, this is the protocol for dealing with someone who's gone through incredibly violent sexual abuse, right? There are certain protocols related to sexual abuse in hospitals that are expected simply because it becomes a legal case and it has to be a government hospital and so on. So the protocol has to be followed in terms of, making sure the clothes are saved and swabs are taken and counseling is done. So similarly, looking at anecdotal data from peer counselors, community counselors, and how they've dealt with different kinds of crises, and having that written down as a protocol. So when we talk about, for example, say young lesbian women who are being hounded by their families because they've identified as lesbian or are in a relationship, immediately the protocol needs to kind of get them to understand, take all your documents if you are leaving from home. Don't keep your passport behind, don't keep your bank documents. Don't have a joint account with your family members at any point if you are planning to get out of your home. Because, these are ways that families manage to kind of impose on their children, right? So a protocol that says, okay, your personal safety first, secondly, safety of all the documentation that you will need in order to start a new life, and then thirdly, looking at occupation, looking at connecting with other supports, and counseling, etc., etc. So that kind of developing protocols based on experiences of helplines, because the way one particular crisis situation is dealt with can vary if, in different states. You can provide this protocol and it will work in Bangalore. It may not work in Guwahati or in Manipur, wherever else. So you'd have to reframe the protocol accordingly. But if you're looking at, say, for example, a medical protocol, a triage, where cardiac issues are being handled, then you know that the protocol for cardiac arrest in Bangalore has to be identical to the protocol in Manipur or elsewhere. So that's where anecdotal data differs from, say, scientific data, because you're not dealing with, say, a physical biological event. You're talking about emotions, you're talking about support systems and other networking areas and so on. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Vinay. And one last question, I think, for both Rupsa and Vinay. Karishma wanted to know if somebody wants immediate solutions, as they call. There's a situation of absolute urgency, and I imagine this comes up more often than one can imagine. How is it that you deal with a situation like that?
Rupsa?
Well, I think that's been an area of struggle for us. Like I said, the ethos, we set out to, kahin baatein and line. So I think to the extent we can mitigate through the Sawal Jawab channel itself, we do, accepting that, because it is now been, because it's a dial-in number, we get calls from all over the country, literally, anybody who can follow Hindi is able to pretty much call and access. So I think that has definitely been, I won't say, over the years, less and less those kinds of calls, but certainly when one hears one of those questions or those calls for help, it is something that one struggles with and yet knows you don't have an answer, honestly. And I think that's one of the things maybe we need to also, I think about more deeply when we look at these kinds of online interventions at scale, and particularly in issues that we work on, SRHR, sexuality, education, etc. Because these are difficult sites that individuals negotiate. And when you put yourself out there in this kind of, distant way, what does that mean? So I think it's an ongoing struggle. And I don't know how one resolves it, because different, when you're in person, when doing an intervention, there is a support system and a peer support you're creating. So that's, I think, I don't think I really have any answer. Vinay?
I would add to that and say, for example, on the helpline, most of the calls, like Rupsa is saying, almost every call wants an immediate solution. There are those who understand that they'll have to call repeatedly to kind of get that support over time. But most of the calls are about, I have 5 minutes, help me now, right? And you have to give them the magic pill. And I've had situations where I'm providing support and the call gets cut because the person is not getting what they want. We deal with those kind of situations too, but mostly when it comes to looking at, for example, cases where people want an urgent response, we inquire, why is there urgency? Is the urgency related to the crisis itself, or because they feel they have reached a kind of, the last straw on the camel's back? Because then you're dealing not with the crisis, but more with the emotional status, right? If you haven't been able to solve, say, for example, a family crisis that's been there for the last 15 years, why do you think it can happen over the period of one 45-minute call, right? To get them to understand, how these processes happen and why you're thinking like that is more important. This is kind of the basis of cognitive behavior therapy in any case, right? But so then you kind of help them investigate why that is. And one of the bigger things that I do as a peer counselor is to get people to understand the difference between, my providing this kind of access to support services as opposed to you as a client calling me up and speaking to me. And I have to keep telling them, follow the process, be committed to the process. Don't be committed to the person who is giving you or facilitating the process for you, right? The person providing you the counseling is not the counseling itself, right? They're only facilitating a process. So you might speak to somebody the first time and engage with them, and they give you advice or suggestions on how to deal with the problem. And you listen to the problem and you can't deal with it, or you can't apply it, or you think, no, this is not going to work. And I have to tell them, don't give up. Go to the next counselor. You can give up on the counselor, you can give up on the organization helping you, right? But don't give up on asking for help, right? So go to your next counselor, and if that doesn't work, go to the next counselor. If that doesn't work, go to the next counselor. This is a trial and error method, right? This is something that I don't know. Maybe Biva and Rupsa can talk about whether, technology can do that, right? Because is there that sense of human, understanding that if it doesn't work now, you keep trying, right? And we tell them, you might meet the 10th counselor and you think this counseling process doesn't work. But by the time you've met the 10th counselor, you have told your story 10 times. You've learned to recognize the patterns of your own behavior 10 times. So by the time the 10th counselor gives you a set of advice that might be exactly identical to counselor number 1, you have learned that applying those in the way that recognizes your pattern starts working for you. So it is about sticking to the process and not giving up. And that's where we kind of focus our energies on, telling people, we're not trying to solve your problem. If you get suggestions from us, it might work, it might not work. But if it doesn't work, don't give up. Keep trying.
In other words, it's me, it's not you.
It could be me.
It could be me, it may not, but you should not give up.
Exactly.
Thank you, Vinay. I want to, sorry, go on.
No, I'm basically saying that I could be counselor number 1 in that scenario. I could be counselor number 10 in that scenario, right? The advice that I give doesn't change, but the way that person engages with that information is also important. But many counselors think of themselves as so much more superior. Psychiatrists will tell you, no, you do this, it'll work, right? As opposed to, because then the person will give up and say, okay, it's not working. Obviously, there's something wrong with the process. Psychiatrist is right. He's a doctor, as opposed to me telling you it might work, it might not work, but don't give up. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Not at all, and that's a hard one because they want to encounter somebody who say that they know about it. And there's a question that I want to ask that ties in with the question that's just been asked by Karishma, saying, and this is to Biva, can a chatbot act like a counselor, since we are talking about iterative machine learning, artificial intelligence? And I want to tag on my question to that before we come to the end of this fascinating session, which is, what does it do to you at the other end of this? And this is something is very important to speak about. Biva, you looking at these hundreds and thousands of questions and getting a sense of the pulse of the landscape, if you will. Vinay, Rupsa, you're often at the end of a human voice that's asking these questions, often in times of distress, need. And I do think it's important to talk about what it does to you. How is it that you're able to then deal with your own subject position in being the recipient of the SAWAAL? So Biva, if I could ask you to start us off.
Sure. I think in terms of chatbot, it's a yes and no. So absolutely, I think I think technology is advancing really quickly, and a lot of these advancements mean that you can, again, here it's kind of the scale aspect where you can answer all of these questions at scale. But at the same time, I think that human element is incredibly important. So the kind of work that Vinay and Rupsa are doing, that is something that I don't think technology, as much as you may train a machine learning model, that will necessarily come through within an AI or a machine. But again, this could change according to our times, but that's my own opinion. I think just in terms of how and we've seen a lot of data points that are quite upsetting, even if we are looking at it from a bird's eye view. We've seen in the last year that searches in India around suicide have grown by 80%. We've done work on child protection. So absolutely, a lot of disturbing data points come to light. I think for me, it's also, this is also where the community-based organizations are kind of, it's like a community that's working towards this. So the work that YP and Agents of Ishq do, but in a lot of our research where we've looked at violence against women and girls online, as much as we see a lot of this misogyny online growing as well, we also see that girls are carving these spaces to really fight for themselves. And that's encouraging. And I know there is, a gender divide within the digital world, but there are also ways where girls are navigating these, and building support communities for themselves. They're finding ways to report people. And I think that is incredibly encouraging, is that outpouring of support and allyship as well.
Thank you, Biva. Rupsa, can I ask you the same, having done this work for such a long time now, as to how do you preserve hope, possibility?
I'll make it quick. One line. I think we're kind of running out of time for our session. I'll say that for me, kahi and kahi baate, if I thought of our role and us, many of us who contribute to that space, it's like, when you're somebody's confidant, right? You treasure it, you protect it, you try to do right by it, you do what you can. And to me, that's always been. And therefore, I think, it's been a very incredible space of both learning. So that's why, when I talk about the SAWAAL, I got those SAWAALs like a confidant and not led big data and all of that in a way. So for me, the SAWAAL is, I don't even think of it as data in the way that we think about data. So I'll just stop there.
Just to, sorry. Yeah, I was going to add to Rupsa's, but before that, I think I'd also respond and add to what Biva said, because, in terms of whether chatbots can really be counselors, if you consider what I said about, counselor number 1 as opposed to counselor number 10, there are situations where people with anxiety don't necessarily interact well with human interaction. So in those contexts, it might be a lot easier to talk to a chatbot as opposed to talk to a person on the phone, right? They have incredible severe social anxiety and they won't be able to connect with another human on the phone. So in those contexts, I think just someone who's a presence, who's able to talk to them online and then slowly facilitate a change over to human interaction where, more guidance can be provided would be valuable. And I think that's probably where some of it might help. Another area where it might help, for example, I get a lot of calls from, say, people who are going through transition through surgeries or want to become trans men or trans women. And if a trans woman calls me, they're not necessarily comfortable talking to someone who is man or male identified or sounds like a man. They're not comfortable with that. So and I don't have a counselor who's identified as a woman who can actually take the call. So then it becomes easier to say, okay, the chatbot might be a better way. So there are definitely areas where to initiate conversations, or at least to bring a kind of rapport towards human interaction, that might help. Now, what does that leave us to do? I started with 18 volunteers back in the year 2000. And right now I'm the only one operating the helpline in 5 languages and doing all the work. Am I burnt out? I probably burnt out around 2003. It hasn't struck me yet. You get to a point where, you know, doing this becomes unconscious. You're conscious of the necessary emotional attachment necessary, the empathy that's necessary, because it's part of your community. You're dealing with somebody whose journey you recognize and understand. But the exhaustion of it is still, you know, I don't think a chatbot will feel that, you know, that sense of, you know, how many more horror stories can I handle, right? That becomes something worth it. And maybe the you know, the area, actual conversations around pleasure might be a way outside of that. So let's see what the future brings.
Thank you, Vinay. And I do think we need a whole separate panel and conversation to speak about the kind of disproportionate emotional labor of those who are having to handle the failures of state and society, if you will. But that's a whole different kettle of questions. I'm going to wrap up now because we are just 2 minutes over time, which I'm very proud of, with a pleasurable data story of my own, to say that when I was working with call center workers, there were 2 stories that stood out, and they had nothing to do with actual call center work. One was young people, men and women, would always talk about senior citizens calling from the US and the UK, which they serviced, calling 1-800 lines because they were lonely and they merely wanted to speak to someone at the end of the line, and how they formed impressions of America as a terribly lonely place as a result of these interactions. The second story, which was kind of urban legend floating around the call center, was of someone who would call up every now and then, and people would sort of, you know, share stories about who was lucky enough to get this call, would call, and in a husky, hushed voice would say, "Are you ticklish?" So everybody would call her the ticklish lady, who just called up to have this kind of weird, uncategorizable, pleasurable conversation, asking if somebody was feeling ticklish in a terribly seductive voice that nobody could classify and I couldn't theorize. So I'm left at the end of all these wonderful conversations to say that the question is never just a question. The sawal may not always have a jawab. The sawal may well be a set of symptoms that we ought to read as testimony to the state of society and how things are changing, and of complex landscapes of misery, but also pleasure, hope, and possibility. And now falls upon me the pleasurable task of thanking Rupsa, Biva, Vinay, and Atul, who's been with us throughout this conversation. Thank you all for your time. Thank you so much for sparing your thoughts and for sharing your work. And I will now hand it over to the wonderful teams at the YP Foundation and AWA.